Welcome to intelligenceanalysis.org. This week, we explore the evolving landscape of geopolitical risk. Rather than isolated incidents, the security picture is shaped by ongoing structural pressures. Key developments emerged from the Middle East, where the U.S Iran relationship seems more focused on managing conflict than achieving resolution. In the eastern Mediterranean and Levant, Israel's ground operations remain active. Meanwhile, tensions in the Indo-Pacific are escalating, particularly in the South China Sea, where we see a growing contest of coercion, signaling, and alliance messaging. This week, we focus on a critical theme: the consolidation of instability across multiple theaters rather than mere escalation. Governments, shippers, investors, and security planners now face a reality where crisis management is routine. Three key developments highlight this shift. First, U.S Iran diplomacy has evolved into a containment strategy with limited benefits, rather than a path to lasting peace. Second, the South China Sea remains a hotspot, with ongoing tensions between China and the Philippines, increasing the risk of miscalculations. Third, the interconnected nature of global conflicts means that instability in the Middle East, maritime disruptions, and cyber threats are reinforcing one another. For strategic audiences, the key takeaway is that uncertainty has become a governing condition. The pressing question is whether institutions, supply chains, and policymakers can withstand repeated stress without overreacting or becoming complacent. Top developments this week. In the Middle East, Stratfor assessed that ongoing U.S.-Iran talks are more likely to contain the war than produce a comprehensive peace, which suggests a prolonged period of managed hostility rather than closure. In the South China Sea, CSIS reported that China-Philippines tensions remain elevated and show no sign of easing, with recent coercive actions, allied naval exercises, and a dangerous air interception all pointing to a more crowded and brittle security environment. Stratfor's latest situation reports also highlighted continuing turbulence across multiple regions, including Lebanon, Syria, Senegal, South Africa, and the China-Pakistan relationship, reinforcing the sense that geopolitical stress is spreading across theaters rather than remaining localized. The Red Sea remains strategically significant as a third battlefield linked to the wider conflicts around Gaza and Ukraine, with ongoing attacks on shipping continuing to shape commercial risk and military posture. Cyber remains embedded in the broader security picture, not as a separate lane but as a persistent enabler of disruption, influence, and coercion across state and non-state actors. Regional analysis. Middle East. The most consequential development remains the unstable balance between confrontation and diplomacy. Stratfor's assessment that U.S.-Iran talks are more likely to contain the war than resolve it is important because it resets expectations. The likely outcome is not breakthrough but episodic stabilization, with recurring moments of tension and bargaining. That matters for energy markets, shipping, force posture, and regional partners who are already planning around volatility rather than peace. Israel-related dynamics continue to be a major driver of regional risk. Stratfor noted IDF ground operations in southern Lebanon, underscoring how the northern front remains active and how quickly local incidents can draw in wider strategic calculations. Even where direct escalation is absent, the risk environment stays elevated because military operations, deterrence messaging, and diplomatic maneuvering are all occurring simultaneously. The Red Sea and Gulf of Aden continue to function as a corridor of strategic fragility. A Japanese strategic analysis described the area as a third battlefield linked to Ukraine and Gaza, which is a useful framing because it captures the way maritime insecurity now reflects broader geopolitical conflict rather than purely local maritime crime. For shippers and insurers, the implication is continued risk pricing, route adjustment, and dependence on convoy-style security logic. Regional analysis. Indo-Pacific. The South China Sea remains one of the clearest examples of controlled but persistent escalation. CSIS documented a pattern of China Coast Guard pressure, Philippine resupply operations, allied naval support, and risky aerial behavior that together create a high-friction environment with limited room for error. The key point is not that war is imminent, but that every encounter increases the chance of an accident being misread as intent. The alliance dimension is just as important as the maritime one. CSIS noted multilateral naval exercises involving the United States, the Philippines, Japan, Canada, and France alongside Chinese counter-drills and new uncrewed buoy deployment near Scarborough Shoal. That suggests Beijing is now responding not only to Manila, but also to the broader signaling architecture around the dispute. This week also highlighted how regional security is becoming more integrated with diplomatic theatre. Upcoming high-level appearances in Southeast Asia and Korea create opportunities for public messaging, but the underlying dispute will be shaped less by speeches than by whether the main actors can avoid a serious incident at sea or in the air. The risk is that incremental coercion normalizes a more dangerous baseline. Europe and Eurasia. Europe remains anchored by the war in Ukraine even when it is not the single headline of the day. The strategic significance this week is that the conflict continues to shape European defense coordination, sanctions logic, and the broader argument about industrial resilience, even as attention shifts to other theatres. That matters because the war's effects are now embedded in procurement, logistics, and political cohesion. Stratfor's latest reporting also pointed to a new UK-Poland treaty, deepening defence and security ties. That is not just bilateral symbolism. It reflects a wider European trend toward tighter security coordination in response to a more durable sense of threat, especially on NATO's eastern flank. The region's challenge is no longer only the war itself, but the institutional burden of sustaining preparedness across an extended period. That includes munitions, air defense, intelligence sharing, and a political discipline required to keep public attention focused on a conflict that has become chronic rather than episodic. Africa. Africa's security picture this week was mixed but revealing. Stratfor highlighted political and institutional strain in South Africa, where President Ramaphosa moved to block impeachment proceedings, and in Senegal, where internal political tensions appear to be worsening. These are not isolated domestic stories. They matter because governance stress often creates downstream security effects, including protest risk, investor caution, and reduced state capacity. The U.S. interest in a quarantine facility in Kenya, highlighted by Stratfor, also shows how health security, mobility, and strategic infrastructure are increasingly linked. In regions where outbreaks can quickly become security issues, public health is no longer a separate policy lane. More broadly, African developments this week reinforce a familiar but important pattern. Political instability, transnational public health concerns, and external strategic competition are converging. That does not mean the continent is uniformly deteriorating. It does mean that governments and businesses operating there need to evaluate risk in layered terms rather than through single-issue lenses. Cyber and information. Cyber risk continues to function as a force multiplier across theatres. The weekly picture did not feature a single dominant cyber incident, but the presence of cyber as a recurring strategic topic in current intelligence reporting is itself notable. Cyber activity now sits alongside military, diplomatic, and economic pressure as part of the same contest. The practical implication is that infrastructure operators, maritime firms, governments, and defense establishments are dealing with a blended threat environment. Disinformation, intrusion, ransomware, and supply chain compromise increasingly intersect with geopolitical crises rather than appearing as standalone events. That trend matters because it compresses response times. A state facing a maritime incident or border confrontation may also face a cyber intrusion, narrative attack, or disruption of logistics at the same moment. Resilience therefore depends not only on technical defenses, but on the ability to coordinate across political, military, and commercial systems. Strategic implications. The first implication is that crisis management has become a permanent function of statecraft. Governments are no longer dealing with isolated emergencies, but with repeated stress across several theatres, each of which can spill into the others. That raises the premium on early warning, calibrated signalling, and measured escalation control. The second implication is economic. Persistent insecurity in the Middle East and Indo-Pacific is not only a military concern. It affects shipping insurance, route reliability, energy prices, and confidence in trade corridors that global commerce still depends on. Firms should expect volatility to remain a normal operating assumption rather than a temporary disruption. The third implication is alliance politics. In both the South China Sea and Europe, coalition behavior is becoming central to deterrence. The visible alignment of partners matters because it shapes calculations in Beijing and Moscow, but it also creates new commitments that allies will be expected to sustain over time. The challenge is to convert signaling into durable capacity. The fourth implication is that limited conflict may now be the default strategic condition. Instead of decisive outcomes, we are seeing managed confrontation, constrained escalation, and partial containment. That is not stability in the traditional sense. It is a more demanding form of uncertainty because it requires endurance, not just reaction. What to watch next? Any further movement in U.S. Iran diplomacy, especially whether talks produce tangible de-escalation or simply extend a tense holding pattern. New incidents in the South China Sea, especially maritime collisions, water cannon use, aerial intercepts, or unilateral declarations that could trigger another cycle of escalation, whether allied naval and diplomatic activity around Southeast Asia translates into stronger deterrence or merely higher rhetorical temperature. Developments in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, where shipping risk remains tied to the broader regional conflict system. Signs of political instability or institutional strain in Africa, especially where domestic contestation could affect security cooperation or economic confidence. Any cyber incident that intersects with critical infrastructure, shipping, or defense, especially if it coincides with a kinetic or diplomatic crisis. For more on this, you can visit our Substack on www.intelligenceanalysis.org. Thank you, join us next time, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.